Would you like to be more successful than you are? Probably. Do you know how to do it? Probably not. I mean, you might have some idea that you work harder at the things that you're doing, or you see the paths that others have taken as templates, and you get an idea of what success might mean. But of course, success means different things. Does it mean for you have more money? Well, you've seen people with huge amounts of money can have spectacularly terrible lives. Does it mean have more fame? Same thing. Does it mean do more of what you're doing currently? You could be extremely productive and under extreme distress. That's a well-trodden path as well. I only ask the question because success is one of many domains in which there are so many dynamics that in many ways it's impossible to predict what will be successful or what would success mean for you. But because, of course, it seems to be something that we all want in some form, there's a great deal of ink spilled in how to achieve it. In fact, I'll just pull up a list of the current best-selling books. We've got The Psychology of Money, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, Atomic Habits, Sapiens is in there, and Educated. So the top three current bestseller books of November 2025, The Psychology of Money, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and Atomic Habits all surround ways in which you can improve your life. And it's not just a contemporary phenomenon. If I look at the top 10 best-selling nonfiction books of all time, number one is Quotations from Chairman Mao. You can kind of understand why that one might be above the others for propaganda reasons. Number two, Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. But then we've got number three, Think and Grow Rich. Number four is the Guinness Book of Records. Number five, The Alchemist, which is purporting to be of some sort of useful guidance. Then six, You Can Heal Your Life. Seven, The Power of Positive Thinking. Eight, The Road Less Traveled. Nine, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And 10, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So 8 of the top 10 of that list all surround how to improve your life. And none of them are exactly the same. Because if you were to find out the best way to build a bridge that doesn't fall down, there would be set answers and they would all be the same. Or if you want to know the best way to fix an engine, we don't need 1,000 different books because the line of what's correct and incorrect is much more clearly demarcated. When you get to something like how to make the best pavlova, well, that's a bit more dynamic and a bit more subjective. You know, like what fruit do you like to have? How fluffy do you want it to be? How crispy? Whatever. You branch out and you can see why there would be many different cookbooks that might have different ideas on how to make a pavlova. Making a pavlova is so simple compared to obviously all of the input ingredients of even just one human life. So I imagine that the appetite and market for talking about what success can be or how to improve your life are functionally infinite. But the most interesting thing in all of this for me is that it's a domain in which many people, to gain traction or because they genuinely believe it, profess to have a kind of certainty that is, I think, impossible to attain. There seem to be as many paths to success or failure as there are people. And whilst a lot of those paths can look very similar a lot of the time, no two lives are in fact identical. And of course, the type of success that may completely sate somebody will be alienating and painful for someone else to experience. So I want to dig around the idea of success and how little we know, just to serve as a kind of comforting yardstick to realize that any number of the external metrics that other people might have to measure their own or your success and the advice subsequently that you may encounter or the approval or disapproval or whatever, kind of just to offer a bit of perspective that allows us to sort of step back from being too concerned about that and hopefully ultimately having the measure to trust our own experience with how we're going. Because however you relate to this at your own level, it is ultimately something that is up for you to navigate and determine and make peace with. And there's frankly just so much garbage on this matter for across every single discipline out there. And because it's so accessible now, I imagine that it would be more alienating, or at least more specifically alienating to each of us to encounter this stuff than it may have been in the past. And so I guess this is just like a bit of a touch grass from me. And if you've already achieved the ultimate Zen balance, like nobody that I've known, then I hope that you can still enjoy the tour around some interesting anecdotes, because whether it's in health, sport, life, relationships, politics, music, whatever it might be, there are so many strong examples that seem to run counter to conventional wisdom that it really is the case of the exception proving the rule, where the rule has to be we really just don't understand a lot of the world, despite all the domains in which we profess to do so. Whether you're a first-time listener or a rusted-on patron, thank you so much for listening and welcome to the Chris Endrey Show. Delighted to have you here. If you want to have a say in the topics that we explore and support the work that I'm doing, head on over to patreon.com/Endrey. And if you've already done all that or you're not interested in doing that, I would love it so much if you could take a second, whatever platform you're on, to give me 5 stars, a thumbs up, and to share an episode with someone you know might get something out of it. It's a pretty humble ask, but I can't tell you how much I'll appreciate you for taking the time to do it. All right, let's get stuck in. in 2002, when touring around Australia, the White Stripes played at the Corner Hotel in Melbourne. And during a sound check, Jack White was playing around and came up with a riff. He really liked the riff, so he kept it in his head, and he was saving it for a potential Bond theme down the line. But when he took it to his then roommate and record executive at Third Man Records, Ben Swank, Swank said that the riff was just okay and said, to quote, that White could do better. Obviously, I'm telling this story because the riff was dun, 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 which, if you for some reason don't listen to any music, is the riff for Seven Nation Army, a song that took over the world so much that you can still hear it chanted in soccer stadiums all around the world today. And not only that, while the White Stripes were already successful when he wrote it, it now, again, still 22 years later, is their most played song on Spotify with 2 billion plays at a ratio of just under 10 to 1 over their second most played song, Fell in Love with a Girl. I'm telling this story in part because I love thinking about songwriting and I love the White Stripes. But where it obviously feeds into today is that it's easy to imagine a world in which a musician takes something to their record executive and the executive is indifferent and then they give up on whatever the sound is. But of course, a record executive, while they might have expertise relative to the average person on what might or might not be successful, that expertise is nowhere near approaching the 100% that you would need to be wielding big decisions about what to go with and what not to go with. It's just a chance-based thing because there are so many more dynamics about what's going to work and what's not going to work and what people are going to like and not like. I mean, in this instance, Jack White backed himself and wrote the song, but there's any number of other incidents of artists being unsure and almost cutting the songs that define them. Freddie Mercury almost rejected Bohemian Rhapsody at first, and Queen's bassist John Deacon expressed fears that to release it would prove the greatest error of judgment of Queen's career. Radiohead hate Creep, maybe not surprising, but it almost didn't exist at all. They wrote it in rehearsal one day, then the next day they were checking levels in a recording studio, and they just wanted to play it for each other and happened to record it, but it was only released thanks to pressure from the producer. And get this, this is Tom York speaking. I wasn't very happy with the lyrics. I thought they were pretty crap. Greenwood, the band's guitarist, tried to sabotage the recording of the song. So that's the sound of Johnny trying to fuck the song up. He really didn't like it the first time we played it, so he tried spoiling it. That's the clashing instrumentals that you hear in the song. Dave Grohl claims that Nirvana almost threw out Smells Like Teen Spirit because they thought it was too much of a rip off of the Pixies. James Hetfield was afraid to release Nothing Else Matters, to put it on an album because he thought it was too vulnerable. And the Rolling Stones nearly left I Can't Get No Satisfaction without releasing it all. And that ended up becoming their first US #1 hit, and obviously extremely famous song. Which all just goes to show that if the people within these projects and the ecosystems around them don't feed back the data that what they're doing is good or going to be liked, then how can you expect to have a reasonable assessment of creative projects at your own level? And the answer is obviously you can't. So you just need to back your own feelings and do stuff in a way that serves you and is enjoyable. I was at a dinner once with Gautier, and it was just a few years after he'd done Somebody That I Used to Know, which just went through the stratosphere and was #1 in the US, etc. And I went to ask him, and I was like, did you have any idea? And before I even finished the sentence, he was like, no, not at all. Because I think he was just writing stuff on his own in Mornington, just like recording it himself. Like, what conception can you have of where things could go? Anyway, it just goes to show. I hope it's a positive model if you're making stuff to keep at it, because you don't know where stuff can land or how far away you are from particular visions of success. Of course, as I said at the very top, do any of these artists, are they guaranteed to be living better lives than you because they have had this success? No, of course not. And they come with their own challenges. These are a well-known phenomenon, so I don't want to morally earbash you about it, but I just think it's interesting. And it's not a phenomenon that's restricted to music. Bryce Courtney wrote The Power of One as his first book, and he thought of it as a practice book and was just using it as a doorstop, basically, because he thought he needed to write a few more novels to understand how to do the craft and to do well. And of course, when it was published, it instantly became a classic. And just like with music, it's not just the artists doubting themselves that stall projects, but convincing the establishment authority figures to publish stuff is also a critical thing. There's many instances of great successes that, if it wasn't for the persistence of the artist and belief in their own work, would never have come to pass. And these include some astonishing ones. Catcher in the Rye was initially rejected by several publishers. June is a famous one. It was rejected by at least 20 publishers before being published by a company that primarily made auto manuals. Think of how well they went on to do out of that. Harry Potter was almost never published. It was rejected by 12 publishers with feedback saying that it was too long and not marketable. And it was only eventually published by Bloomsbury Publishing because the chairman took it home and their 8-year-old daughter read it and loved the first chapter. I mean, it's obviously kids know more about what they're going to like in kids' books than adults. Anyway, And Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, was rejected by over 30 publishers before his wife found the manuscript in the trash, had a flick through it, and encouraged him to finish it. It's kind of hard to imagine, given the gateways that things have to go through to get made, the creator putting the effort into making something and then believing in themselves enough to shop it around, and then other people to do it, and then publishing it and to getting it to you. It's kind of a miracle we have anything, but think of how many wondrous works there must be that are just never made, or are sitting on someone's hard drive right now, or in the rejection pile of some publishing executive. It's funny because it's inevitably going to be by far more and statistically just of a higher quality than all of the published works that have ever existed. It's a fun little thought experiment. Anyway, all that serves to give another clear example that it's very hard to know what will be successful, even for so-called experts. And you might think, well, of course, it's hard to predict things in creative realms because everything's subjective. That's definitely true, but there's any number of realms in which it seems that people should have a good reason to know what will go well and what won't, or what success can and can't look like, where we fail again and again, and the outliers prove that. One striking example that's probably crossed your radar, or at least I hope, is the success of Nikola Jokic in the NBA. I mean, if you don't know who he is, picture in your mind what the best, most dominant basketball player probably looks like. And you've got he's tall, but kind of everything else wrong. Like he's tubbier than other players, he's slower than other players, he doesn't look that athletic. For the last 5-6 years in a competition full of the best athletes on the planet, he is dominated. And you might then think, if you don't know who he is, you might then think, well, for someone to do that, they probably have to have the best mindset. And the best mindset means exercising really hard. The best mindset means caring only about the game, having that sort of Kobe Bryant Mamba mentality, always thinking about how to be more competitive than everybody else and putting in the hours at the gym. But he's an outlier in that stuff in the NBA, not to the degree in which he is good at it, but to the degree in which he seems to not care at all. And it's not just an affectation either. He really spends the off seasons dancing on tables, drinking with his friends, racing his horses. The main thing he seems to be passionate about in life is racing his horses back in Sombor in Serbia. And if you follow the line all the way back to the start of his career, you could see at points all people, but even still at most points, most people, including all the experts, there's a lot of money in the NBA. There's a lot of money in finding good basketball players and a lot of expertise. A lot of people spend their entire life watching basketball and interacting at a high level with this stuff. And the key theme from his career as a junior to today seems to be the underestimation of his capacities. And this is in an environment where he's playing nonstop. There's thousands of cumulative hours of all of these players that you can watch and see how they're going, if they're dominating or whatever. And famously, when the draft came, this guy who goes on to be the best player in the whole league for many years and does many things that no players have ever done before. When he was drafted in 2014, he went at pick 41, which is a pick so low that it wasn't broadcast on TV. There was a Taco Bell ad going when it was announced. And he claims to have not eaten Taco Bell to this day. I don't know if that's true. And even as a junior in Serbia, he wasn't the most fancied player for a lot of his career. I saw one of the coaches who picked him up. He'd never heard anything about him from any of his scouts or anything, but he just looked in the newspapers at all the regional games and all the scores, and he noticed that one guy just happened to be scoring a lot, but he'd slipped through all the radars because his physique doesn't match the conventional wisdom of what a basketball player who's going to have a successful athletic career looks like. Now, obviously, it can't be the case that he doesn't care about basketball or that he's not athletic or that he isn't fit. But in a league where you've got the best athletes and full of people who care about it the most and are the fittest and strongest, it is noteworthy that a player who is seemingly the bottom end of that pack for those types of traits is at the top of the pack for performance, particularly without being gifted what people would consider to be the obvious physical traits like elite speed or a high jump or elite strength. There's a quote of him doing the rounds where he's been asked about his success or whatever. He says, healthy sleep, 2 liters of water a day, no alcohol or cigarettes, proper nutrition, regular workouts, cold showers. That's exactly what I'm absolutely not interested in. He likes to be funny and is more sarcastic than, I guess, American culture. So it's hard to know. I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure he eats well and exercises a lot. But he does seem to, one player accused him of drinking 6 beers a day in the off season and largely avoiding basketball entirely, which is like, even for me who knows this information, it's kind of hard to process as true. Whereas on the exact other end of this spectrum, you've got a fellow Serbian, also nicknamed the Joker, who is also the top of their sport, Novak Djokovic. He's an outlier at the other end, where he absolutely controls everything that goes into his body to a degree that's hard to imagine. Take a quote from Novak Djokovic from a book on his life story. How much discipline? In January 2012, I beat Nadal in the finals of the Australian Open. The match lasted 5 hours and 53 minutes, the longest match in Australian Open history, and the longest Grand Slam singles final in the Open era. Many commentators have called that match the single greatest tennis match of all time. After I won, I sat in the locker room in Melbourne. I wanted one thing, to taste chocolate. I hadn't tasted it since the summer of 2010. Milian brought me a candy bar. I broke off one tiny square, and I popped it into my mouth, let it melt on my tongue. That was all I would allow myself. That was what it had taken to get to number one. That's 13 years ago now. And I guess from the kind of discipline that he has, he's been able to play through to an age that other tennis players are not able to perform at that level, and to stay at that high level in a way where other tennis players seemingly struggle to keep the motivation to constantly win. But in any case, it's if you're advising a young athlete on what they should do to be successful, like what do you say? Do you say in your off season, you need to be competition fit and training nonstop and your diet and behavior needs to reflect that? Or do you say, oh, in your off season, have a bunch of beers, don't even think about it. Like what's going to be optimal for success? Like the obvious answer is it's going to be different for different people in different environments. I don't want to hit this with too heavy a hammer. Obviously, if you're going to get good at something, you need to practice doing it. And if you're going to be competing with people that have a great physical fitness, you're going to need to have some level of comparable fitness. And there are things that you know that you can do to achieve that. You're never going to be the number one tennis player in the world if you don't pick up a racket and hit some balls at some point. But I do find it really interesting at the top level of sports how there seem to be so many different ways of going about achieving the same goal, where the goal is excellence in the arena. And how the difference between that seems to be a balance of the psychological proclivities of the individual, the dynamics of the environment that they're in, and the raw situation of what it is to be on a court or in the arena trying to be better than everyone else that's there. It's cool. And you see it in team sports as well, where there'll be a conventional wisdom around, well, to be good, a team has to do this. And then inevitably someone comes along who just asks a question, well, why is that the case? Let's do it differently. And that team will do really well. And because there are so many dynamics, the reason that a team that does a different thing will do well might have nothing to do with doing the different thing itself. And disaggregating what are successful behaviors from unsuccessful behaviors is just part of the art of how people navigate those arenas. And I think analogous to how you and I might be well served to navigate success or failure in our own lives as well. These sorts of stories abound, and I don't want to get too sucked into giving you each and every one of them, but can't go past this topic without saying that Tom Brady was a 6th round pick in the NFL. He was picked 199 overall because he was skinny and was slow over 40 yards. And he went on to be, I guess, the undisputed greatest of all time at that sport. Even Michael Jordan was cut from his high school varsity team. I understand that probably most of you listening to this podcast are aspiring to be the greatest athlete of all time in your chosen discipline. But I think the transferable lesson is not to take point in time setbacks or universal assessments as indicative of permanent realities or even of the contemporary reality. I think Jokic is a great example. He's coming in at pick 41. No one thinks he's going to be good. And he's just, 10 years later, he's in the conversation of the greatest players of all time. There's also something interesting about the psychology of collective narratives and how once outliers have been entrenched, they just seem as though they were inevitable the whole time, which is kind of hard to process, I guess, because that's a phenomenon that we all feed into with our very human thinking patterns. Reminds me of what I thought was a Mandela quote, but I just looked it up and it's apocryphal. But the quote is, everything always seems impossible until it's done. And there's a similar one, which is also apocryphal, attributed to Einstein, which is everything is impossible until someone who doesn't know that comes along and does it. Because once something is established, we no longer think about how unlikely it was that it might ever exist. Say, for example, successful companies like Google or McDonald's or something like that. We might think, well, it's obvious people are going to want to eat lots of trashy hamburgers and people are going to want to search to use the internet. So always those things were going to come along and be successful. But it's not necessarily the case that either needed to exist at all or that search engines even needed to exist necessarily, certainly not in the form that they are now. And there are also seemingly infinite examples across the business realm of people who have become successful despite both the people within the organization not thinking that it would be successful and people without the organization certainly dismissing whatever it was that they're doing. And again, just like the example of the NBA where you've got lots of people watching the players, like there are a lot of people out there trying to make money, particularly people in organizations with money. They're looking at ways of making more money always. And you have an entire class of professionals whose sole focus is to identify whatever they think it is that's going to be successful in the world and to give it money so that they can generate massive returns for themselves. And still, there's no end of examples, really, of almost everybody missing the boat on something that subsequently went on to become really big. Just to pick a couple, but I'll start off with an Australian one. Canva, you might not know, Canva's Australian. Melanie Perkins, the founder, was rejected by over 100 investors who all thought that an easy online design tool was going to be pointless because Photoshop exists. She kept pitching her business idea for years while running a side business teaching design at university. Today, Canva is worth up to $40 billion. Dyson's another one. James Dyson, the inventor of those bagless vacuums that cost so much money. He went to all the major vacuum manufacturers and they said that having bagless vacuums was a fantasy that would never work. He was fired from his job, maxed out all of his credit cards, and he built over 5,000 prototypes over 5 years. Even his wife thought that he was insane. Now, Dyson's a multi-billion-dollar company and he himself is a billionaire. Slack, this is a cool one. It started as an internal chat tool for a gaming company called Tiny Speck, whose game was failing badly. The game was called Glitch. The game studio was days away from shutting down, and even the team within thought that the chat tool was just a side thing to make the last months bearable. They pivoted entirely to the chat tool Slack and then sold it to Salesforce for $27 billion. So it's not even valued by the people who created it and are using it. What's lying around your hard drive that's worth $27 billion? Potentially something. If you go away and realize that something you have is something you could sell for a lot of money, please give me 1%. I'm dying out here. An eerily similar story with Twitter, which was started within a failing podcasting company called Odeo, where the board and all the employees thought that podcasting was the future, and the Twitter prototype they had within was mocked as toy-like and pointless. Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, said almost nobody in the company believed in it, and so when they shut down, they gave all the shares to the Twitter team. And when Twitter was sold to X, it was sold for $40 billion US. Imagine if you held on to 15% of that. Anyway, as I said, there's endless stories of businesses with products that nobody thought would be successful that go on to dominate everything. There are so many of these examples that it's easy to forget that most of the things that you use and walk past, just as all those songs and books or whatever, just as easily could have never existed. And in fact, are probably more likely to never exist. And exciting to think about how many great ideas you, the listener, are sitting on right now that could be really compelling for everybody and, again, radically make you rich in a way that would make you fork off a good 10% of that business to your friendly podcast that reminded you to go for it. One such thing that's been around at such a level of success that you would just assume it was always going to be the case is FedEx, which is originally written out as a concept by a guy called Fred Smith for a term paper in Yale. And he was given a C for it by his professor, who said it was an interesting idea but not feasible. That professor was looking pretty smart because in the first few years of its operation, it almost bankrupted multiple times. In fact, at one point, Smith flew to Vegas and won $27,000 on blackjack so he could meet their payroll obligations. But of course, today it's hard to imagine that company not existing as worth $70 billion. So this tour around the huge outliers of success is, I hope, inspirational or encouraging to you if you are engaged in any realms that do have those sort of outlier, unpredictable paths to the future. But I think it's also reasonable and fair to talk about conceptions of success that are maybe more relatable to our day-to-day lives and less about being the greatest tennis player of all time. Because obviously almost everyone on the planet could do everything in their behavior and have everything around them in their environment identical to Djokovic and Serena Williams and Federer and Nadal and Steffi Graf and whoever else, and not end up making even the top 10,000 of tennis players. And that's where having a reckoning with what success in your own life means for you. Because I'm sure that you might be surprised if you ask those astounding athletes what success means for them, how many of them would say things that were not related to dominating the sport in the way in which they did. Because like anything that you strive for that you want, once you have it, it changes your perspective on what it meant to get it and what you might want to do next. So for that reason, it shouldn't really be surprising when you see instances of people who are the greatest at whatever they did to consider their success to be time with their family or the joy of being on whatever journey they've had rather than the amount of trophies that they have in the cabinet, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's all pretty known to us in folklore terms anyway, money can't buy happiness, blah, 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 blah. But it would be irresponsible, I think, for me to say that there aren't things that we could all do to be more successful in whatever it is that we're trying to do, or even more successful in understanding what it is that we're trying to do. And that in some domains of life, there really aren't upper limits in what you can hope to improve upon in being able to have more of the things you want and avoid more of the things that you want less of. And of course, those things aren't going to be, I hope that I win more Grand Slams and I hope that I have less losing Grand Slam moments. It's going to be moments of happiness and joy and peace and, giving to others and whatever it might be. Unsurprisingly, most of us are oriented in that way where being able to give to others and spend time sharing things, being able to set a goal and to attain it are the most meaningful things for us. So I guess I want to end this episode with just a moment of offering up to you the enthusiastic support for interrogating that and finding whatever it is that looks like it might be for you. and to have the peace to set your own terms in what goals you go for. Because one thing that most of the people that we've talked about today would have in common is that if you talk to them at the age of 15, 20, or even 40 or 50, if they'd shared the aspiration of the thing that they do achieve with those around them, even their closest friends possibly wouldn't have been out of line to say, you're mad and you shouldn't bother doing it. Now, had James Dyson made fewer than 5,000 vacuum cleaners, if he was sitting in a garage of 4,000 vacuum cleaners and completely in debt and his life had fallen apart, is that something that you want to go for? Probably not. But I guess ultimately you have to make peace with the idea that you get to take your own assessment of what is and isn't worth doing. And while it's one thing to know that everybody else doesn't know what that is, you also don't know what it is necessarily. I think you kind of have to make peace with the consequences of likely failure while keeping an eye on what it would be to be successful. I'm not sure if you know this, but I run coaching sessions, both for people in the arts and have coached a couple of sporting teams in my time. And an advice I've given in the past, which is something that strikes me as a good idea, is to do the work as though something will be extremely successful, but have the fortitude and resilience within your life, both personally and structurally, to accept the consequences of whatever your long shot ambition is of not coming off. But while you're in the arena, do it as though it will. And it is in the spirit of that final note that I let you know that if you do want to get in touch, actually, please feel free. I have capacity to take on more people in my coaching roster at the moment. So get in touch if you're interested in that. And also, don't forget to share this podcast around with people who you think might be interested in it or benefit from it. Thanks so much to my lovely patrons for your ongoing support. If you want to join up, head on over to patreon.com/Endrey. And I think if you're the type of person who's curious about the world and engaging with its ideas, that you have made it to the end of this episode, give yourself a pat on the back, because to me, you are as successful as I could please, because we're redefining success, and success is listening to the Chris Endrey Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. Have a great week.